Good afternoon and welcome to the Lunchtime series with me, Britz, leading the charge with insights, information, and ultimately effective results in everything coaching, leadership, and marketing. Please remember to like and share and help us grow our channel even further. Today, in our leadership and marketing segment, we have a very interesting guest joining us all the way from the United Kingdom. And he's a psychologist, leadership consultant, assessor and coach, award-winning author, media commentator, and speaker. Has 40 years experience, includes both commercial and HR roles, consulting and plus over a decade in forensics, psychotherapy. Joining us all the way from United Kingdom, Nick Kinley. Nick, how are you doing?
Very well, thanks. Very well, thanks. And you?
Thank you for, well. Thank you. And thank you for making some time to just be with us on the show today. And we're going to be speaking about something that's I'm very passionate about. I also work in a leadership capacity and have for some time now. But when I saw some of the information that was shared about what your book is about, I was like, this is a beautiful, like someone's written something about this, and that's really interesting. So before we dive right into that, do you want to give us a bit of background about a bit about you and just tell the audience who you are and a little bit more than just my intro?
So yeah, my name's Nick Kinley. I'm a psychologist. I'm a psychotherapist, but I started off life in sales and marketing for about 6-7 years. And then I did what everyone does, which is to go to prison. I should say not as an inmate, but I retrained as a psychotherapist, where I spent kind of 10-12 years assessing people. Should they be released? Should they stay inside? And trying to change people's behavior. And I stayed there for a decade doing that. And then I went into consulting. And then I went to work for BP. I went to work for Barclays in kind of HR. I went back into consulting. But really what I've been doing for kind of like the last 35, 40 years is kind of assessment and behavior change. And that's really what my gig has been for that last kind of like 35, 40 years. But for the last 15 years as well, I've kind of worked alongside colleagues at IMD Business School over in Lausanne in Switzerland, kind of leading a research program, which much to my wife's dismay has kind of led to kind of 9 books. I haven't quite managed to tell her yet there's going to be a 10th one, maybe over Christmas after she's had a few drinks. I'll kind of maybe slip that into conversation.
Yeah.
And the last one of which is what I'm here to talk about.
That's fantastic. I mean, such a rich career that you've had, and an interesting one going to prison, which is nice for that reason.
And I'm kind of really lucky. I've worked with a kind of diverse group. I've been able to say that I've been able to work with royalty and politicians and with murderers and with children and with sex offenders. And we can have a chat about which of those are the most difficult client group to work with, right? It's probably not the murderers as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I've always been fascinated about the psyche that why people go to prison and some of the strange things they do. But I mean, what was interesting when I saw, the title of the book is The Power Trap, How Leadership Changes People. And when I first saw that, I was like, I don't think a lot of people really think through it that way. But I've experienced this very often, at a leadership capacity where it does change people, and sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad. But tell us, from your perspective, how did you get to this point and to want to write about this conversation?
So I think, so the first thing to say is that I think we have an entirely messed up relationship with power, right? So anyone who is a leader has power. We often don't think about it that way. I mean, I think we often think as power is something that maybe Elon has or Donald Trump has, right? Or the leaders of countries have, but anyone who is a leader of any sort has power. It's the very engine of leadership, right? Anyone who has authority, control of, or influence of any sort has power. But we have an entirely messed up relationship with it. We all kind of want power because it promises safety. It gives us authority. It's the very essence of leadership. And we all kind of want it, but it's nothing that we can really talk about. In essence, it's probably easier to talk about sex than it is to talk about. It's probably more socially acceptable to walk into a room and say, I really enjoy sex, than it is to walk into a room and say, I really enjoy having power over people. You probably can't really say that, right? It's probably not actually permissible to say that. But
yeah.
The problem is that because we don't talk about it, we don't really understand what it is that power does to people. And power can actually be quite a toxic thing, because although it can do some good things to us and it can actually help us do things, it also does some negative things to us. And it can actually be quite difficult, and it can actually be quite toxic. And because of the way that the world is changing, and because of the way that leadership is changing, and leadership has changed over the last 50, 30, 20, 10 years, power is actually becoming more difficult to hold, more difficult to use, and more toxic. And it's actually doing more damage to leaders, more difficult things to leaders. And that's why I think we're actually seeing more leaders in the news in bad ways, in negative ways. And if you think about it, it seems like every week there's a different leader, different CEO in the news who's done really kind of stupid things or difficult things, right? Who's having to resign for having done, something stupid. And so I think power is becoming more difficult to hold, more toxic, doing more damaging things to our leaders. And because we don't talk about it, it's becoming more damaging. And we don't prepare leaders for it. I've never seen a leadership development course that ever says, hey, be careful, right? This thing that you're about to be given, which you all want, right? We all want to be a leader, right? We all want that more senior position. This thing that you're about to be given, that you're ambitious for, actually, you be careful, right? I've never seen a leadership development course that actually prepares people for it. These are the negative things it can do to you. So that's why we went out and wrote this book, to try and say, these are the things that it can do. This is what you need to be careful of. And actually, this is what you can do to try and prepare yourself for it, and just to be careful of. And that was the whole point of it.
What's really interesting about when you started that, you mentioned that it's easier for people to walk into a room and speak about, the wanting to experience sex rather than actual power. Do you think what is that about? Do we attach a certain type of shame to wanting power? What do you think the psyche is doing, and why do we not own it and claim it as something good?
So, I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, I think some of it is almost classist. I mean, certainly in the West, I think there's a certain degree of that, right? That there's a whole degree of classism to it, right? That you look up to, that there's this whole thing of people in power, you kind of assume that they've got a negative intent, right? And they probably have abused their power to a certain extent. There's also that old story of power corrupts. Right? Now, actually, I think that's wrong. I don't think power does corrupt. I think, if anything, people corrupt power. And I think every time that we say power corrupts, we're actually letting people off, because I think there's a whole bunch of people who get power who don't do negative things with it. And I think every time that we say power corrupts, we're actually, in a way, letting people off, and we're kind of blaming power for the bad things that they do, rather than blaming them for what they've done, right? So I think it's partially classist. I think it's partially that story of power corrupts and saying that power is that power can be a bad thing. But it's that, and that there's that thing of, I've got power over you, right? It's that there's something yucky about it, right? It's that. So it's partially classist, partially that thing of control over other people. It's not. There's a very bad negative story around it of control over other people that I think is, exactly as you said, tells a story that I think is, in terms of the psyche, exactly as you said, is negative. I don't think that you want to advertise to other people, right? I've got control over.
And what's interesting, also, as you mentioned, that a lot of people in power today are, really bad examples of leadership.
Yeah. I don't think we've got to look too far, do we?
No. So the question around that is, and this is what I've started noticing just in the last 5 years with COVID and the powers moving into power, or people moving into power, is that there's the generations that are coming up into questioning and voting, quite frankly, they're asking people to be more accountable. And I think because of social media, because of the times we live in, it's easier to have access to different versions of what someone said. So there's an accountability factor in leadership currently that I don't think has ever been so prominent. And relevant to be asked of leaders as it currently is. And I think part of that is also changing the narrative of how we experience leaders or who we choose to see as leaders. Because as we say, the story that we have of leadership has been very negative, and it's been, people in power are X, Y, and Z. But now it's a case of like, well, if you are in power, can you be accountable to the things you say and do?
Unfortunately, I think the story that we're getting of leadership is getting worse and worse. It is becoming more negative. And I think partially the reason for that is that leadership is becoming more and more performative. And I think you can go back to the early 90s when we get 24-hour news, and CNN was the first of those. And breaking news, everything is breaking news, right? And so you get journalism starts changing, and you get journalists looking for news stories. And then you get the internet comes along, you get social media comes along, and then 2000, and you get the first algorithms come along, you get likes come along, and all of a sudden our relationship with the internet changes and people become more image conscious as well. And then you get cancel culture comes along, and all of a sudden people become even more aware of the image that they're creating. And there were some good things that come out of that as well. But I think people's awareness of the image that they're creating is definitely, there's some negative aspects to that. And there's some very solid research evidence that's come out showing that image consciousness has increased significantly. That certainly if you have a look at politics is where it shows most, that the performative element of politics has increased significantly. I think we're also seeing it within businesses as well, in terms of the politics. Corporate politics has increased significantly. And so the performative element of leadership, so the degree to which leaders are expected to be able to tell a good story. Right? It's not just about the degree to which you can do the job well, but you have to be seen to be doing a good job well. So, for example, do you know, wind the clock back 50 years, and one of the best predictors, if not the best predictor of how well you could do a job was intellect, right? Now, these days, one of the even better predictors of how well you can do the job is actually not just how bright you are, but how bright people think you are. So an even better predictor of how bright, how well you can do your job is not just how clever you are, but actually how clever people think you are. So performance is super important in your job. And it's even more important for politicians as well. So the performative element of leadership has become so important. And that means that even more important than how well you can do your job is how well people think you can do your job. And that changes, therefore, not the types of people who are rising to the top. And that is really, really critical, because and I think you only have to look at the types of people that we see in leadership roles in, I think, most of the governments that you can look in the Western world today, or I mean, not just the Western world, but across the globe today. And you can see that there are many successful politicians who are very, very effective at performance, at portraying a certain image. And one of the downsides with that is that they're not always quite so good at following it up with substance. And that then breeds a certain degree of cynicism behind it. And it undermines, I think, our belief in leadership. And my concern, and one of the reasons that we get to in the book, the final chapter in the book is actually on politics and about the impact that politics is having on organizations. Is one of my concerns is that this is undermining our belief in leadership. And what we say is that, look, this is happening in politics, but it's not stopping at the door of the organizations, right? It's seeping into our organizations. It's changing our ideas about leadership, and it's entering into our organizations. And if it's undermining our belief about leaders, it will enter into organizations. And if it's undermining our belief in leaders in politics, it will affect how people see leaders in organizations as well. And because it affects how people feel about leaders, full stop. And if it creates cynicism in leadership in general, it affects all of us as leaders. And that means we all have to work a little bit harder. We all have to work harder to generate genuine belief in ourselves as leaders. And I think it is corrosive to society in general. And it is, it is making leadership harder for everyone. And it is a systemic societal problem.
So from everything you've just said, it would be a fair sort of narrative to say that leadership is in crisis, and we have a problem based on the fact that these are supposed to be the people who lead and who are the example that we follow. Because with enough performance and performative attributes and capability, they do quite well. So we kind of buy into that, because as humans, we have biases and we do it. We tend towards the thing that everyone does. But that, when you start breaking it down into practicality and really the substance that you mentioned, it means we might be in a leadership crisis globally.
Yeah, and I would ask your listeners to look around themselves in their organizations and just ask, are the leaders that you see around you in your organization today compared to 10 years ago, do you think there are more performative leaders around you today than there were 10 years ago or even 5 years ago? I suspect there probably are. I'm absolutely certain there are in politics, but I suspect there are in your organization as well.
I mean, politics are the precursor to what we see as leaders of the society you're living in. So if that's the example you follow, then obviously it's normal, depending on what the country is and what's considered normal, to emulate that and to do what everyone else does. And if we look at South Africa, for example, we have some of the leaders in our country are just the biggest liars. They just lie blatantly, profusely, and it's quite scary.
And the problem is that when you see politicians doing that, right? I mean, and let's take the most obvious version, Trump, right? There's a chapter in the book called We Need to Talk About Donald. And I used Trump because he's the most obvious example. Of I think our modern
ludicrous behavior.
Now there are some fact-checking organizations, and I compare Trump to some of the American leaders who went before him. Now, and British leaders for that matter as well. Now, it's absolutely true that most politicians lie, or shall we say, misstate the facts, right? And that there is pretty much consistency about the degree to which they've done so. And you can compare kind of the previous kind of leaders as well. And it was about 25%, the number of misstatements of the truth that there was before Trump. And then Trump comes along and it suddenly shoots up to like 66, 70%, right? It's just a massive kind of increase. And that was just in his first term. Second term, it's even shot up further. When you see leaders do that, it sets the tone for what other people begin to believe is acceptable. When you see Trump's team attack Congress when they go before Congress to question, right? To not even bother answering the questions and just attack back, it sets the tone for what is acceptable behavior.
Yeah.
For other leaders. And I find it impossible to believe that is not going to change the norm in broader society. Now, I'm not going to say that everyone is going to suddenly copy that, but it seems impossible to believe that it's not going to seep through to some degree.
And with that, because it condones behavior to a large degree, but it also creates a lot of contrast. Is there not an obvious association to seeing bad behavior like that and kind of looking at, if I were ever a president of a country, I would never want to behave like that? Is there not a definitive movement happening to the opposite side of the spectrum, because we clearly have terrible leaders in the world currently?
Yeah. So, I mean, absolutely. I do think that there is a degree of that. But so imagine yourself, so you're a leader of a team, right? I think the single biggest challenge for most leaders today is information flow. Now, I think information flow is a challenge for any leader anyway, right? The moment, we don't talk about it, but the moment you become a boss, you are, people stop telling you the truth, right? They don't mean to, but they will, right? There is distance created between you and the people that you lead. They will start filtering and tailoring what they tell you. I mean, complete openness doesn't exist anyway, right? If you ever meet anyone who's completely open, they are probably single, unemployed, and friendless, right? It just doesn't exist, right? It's like if my wife asks me, does she look good in something? There is only a certain range of things that of responses that are acceptable for me to say to her, right?
Yeah.
It's just, there are, right? We filter our responses to people. And if my boss asks me something, there's only a certain range of things that I can say to them, right? So the moment we become someone's boss, they start filtering what they tell us. Now, we layer onto that a society in which all of a sudden there's social media and likes, and people start becoming more socially more aware of social image. And then we layer onto that, hey, let's layer onto that cancel culture. Now let's layer onto that political leaders who lie. Now let's layer onto that political leaders who attack people who disagree on them. Or let's layer onto that political leaders who start calling journalists piggy and ugly because they start asking them questions who disagree with them, right? Now, some of that crap is going to start filtering through, right?
Yeah.
Is going to start affecting whether your people speak up to you. I refuse to believe that it's not going to start just causing them to pause. It doesn't matter how nice you are, how good you are, how gentle you are as a boss, it might affect them and just cause them to pause and think maybe before they speak up to you, however nice you are, however good you are. So you have to work twice as hard to get people to speak up. And because the world is becoming more absolute, right? More Democrat, more Republican. And sorry, I don't know the South African version of that, right? But in the UK, we have Labour and Conservative, right? Pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit. The world's becoming more kind of, crazy and more white and black and more kind of, it's becoming left and right. And we have to work harder to kind of break down those extremes as a bosses. And so that's one of the, even if we think that we are the exception to that, I think we still have to work harder to stop the impact of everything that's going on the people that work for us.
So one of the questions that we have here is power also changes people's attitudes towards risks, right? And tell just because we've already alluded to that quite a lot, but just if you would, to what degree, does that mean risk at every level? People would take risks to see how much they can get away with?
Yeah. So the research on this is just fun, right? So people who have more power or even just feel more powerful, I mean, so listeners, go away, Google, there was a brilliant video on this appeared recently, power, monopoly, and there's a brilliant video of people who are playing Monopoly and who are winning, and they become complete arses and take all sorts of risks and do all sorts of things just because they feel powerful, right? Just even feeling powerful makes people more likely to take risks. Hence, affairs with subordinates going to Coldplay concerts, right? So, and not just business risks, but pretty much every type of risk you can think of. Outside work, they're more likely to draw a card in a game of blackjack, right? They're more likely to risk blowing extra air into balloons in a balloon pumping game.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right. Seriously, right. In work, they're more likely to take risks in negotiation. For example, by divulging their interests early in a negotiation, they're more likely to pursue high-risk commercial strategies. And this tendency to take more risks increases even further when leaders feel under commercial pressure or report or they're feeling stress. So the only time when it's not so is that power holders who are particularly anxious seem less affected by so power holders who are particularly anxious are less likely to take risks. So if they feel under threat. So the one example I could give to that is that if you take Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer, right, who is very clearly risk averse, right, from the very start has been Mr. Anti-risk, right, and has gone out of his way to avoid risk of any sort in any way and has done his best version of hiding under a rock from risk, right, has run away from risk of any sort, although he seemed to have done his best version of running into mistake after mistake because he feels under threat all the time. But with the exception of people who are very, very sensitive to a threat, with the exception of those people who are very sensitive to threat, the vast majority of people are likely to take extra risk purely just by feeling powerful. And that's why powerful CEOs tend, on average, to take far more risks. So think Elon. They tend to take more risks. And that's why, by the way, powerful CEOs tend to take more risks, and they tend to generate higher profits for shareholders because they tend to take more risks. They tend to generate more wins. They tend to generate bigger wins. They also tend to generate bigger losses.
Yeah.
Because right? Because they'll win more, but they also tend to lose more, right? Because they just take more risks. So they'll win more but lose more.
And this is the ultimate ego boost, right? When people are taking even further risks in a position of power and manage to get away with something, or, and it doesn't fail, or they actually win, it just boosts your ego to that degree, which means you might move to the next obvious risk, bigger risk.
That's brilliant. So power is a wonderful ego boost, but the research shows that ego boost doesn't kick in immediately. So what tends to happen is people take a little risk, they get away with it, and that's when the ego boost kicks in, right? And and the amazing thing is that once the ego boost has kicked in, even if they fail the second time, ego boost remains. And once the ego boost has kicked in, they don't lose it. And they'll just carry on making mistake after mistake because the ego boost has kicked in, right? And what will happen is they'll blame circumstance, they'll blame the situation. It doesn't matter. It's the dog's fault, it's the cat's fault, it's the market's fault, it's their direct report's fault. Hell, Kevin, it's your fault. But, it's not their fault.
And I'm assuming that's exactly what the chapter about Let's Talk About Donald is really emphasizing, because it's never his fault. Everything he does is supremely above all. So it's when you hear it in this context, he does take enormous risk, but he also gets the enormous ego boost because he gets away with so much.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. President, you're the best president there's ever been.
Exactly. Yeah.
And when you've got people around you who are saying that, right? Mr. President, you're the best. Mr. Britz, you're the best podcaster there's ever been.
Yeah.
It's very.
It does sound quite somber, and it sounds quite sad to kind of, it's like, this is the world we're living in. But the fact is, it's a good conversation, and it's necessary to be able to have these conversations and unpack it even further. What is the good news side to this? Because essentially, part of knowing what is wrong is fantastic, but that's also gives you clear indication of what.
So the good news is I think the bad news, the risk is, and remember, I'm English, so we always have to do the bad news and the risk, because we're pessimistic and miserable. It's rained so much, who can blame us, right? Is that I think unaided and without any kind of attempt to kind of do anything about it, I think power reduces everyone. Sooner or later, power reduces everyone who holds it. It doesn't matter how good a regard you hold that leader in, power will reduce everyone who holds it if they have enough of it and they hold it for long enough.
And when you say reduce, what is the reduce? It will reduce you. What do you mean by that?
I think it will lessen your effectiveness.
Okay,
it lessens your effectiveness, right? It will make you less effective as a leader. So take very simply, power distances you from the people that you hold, from the people that you lead, right? So one of the clearest bits of research out there is that on just about every single metric you can imagine, power makes you less empathetic.
Okay.
Makes you less able to understand the perspectives and feelings of the people that you lead. It distances you from the people that you lead. And the more power you have and the longer you have it, the less you are able to understand the people that you lead on every single metric that you can imagine, every single measure. And I mean, no leader likes to believe it, right? I understand my people is what we all like to believe, right? Nope, not at all. But the longer we have it, the more that's so. So power reduces us, but there are things that you can do. The good news is that there are things that we can do to minimize the effect that power has on us, the negative things that power does to us. All we need to do is to deliberately try to do those things. We just need to make some deliberate effort to put those solutions, those things in place, right? We just need to deliberately try to do them. And the wonderful thing is they're not rocket science, right? So much of these things are not rocket science. They're really, really simple. Just all they take is a bit of will, right? They just need a little bit of effort. And that's all it takes. A number of years back, we did a bit of research with IMD, having a look at what the single biggest indicator was in terms of personality characteristics about what really predicted which types of people developed most, which types of as leaders. And it wasn't intelligence. It wasn't EQ or empathy or interpersonal skills. None of that stuff predicted who developed most. It was diligence, discipline. The people who actually were systematic and went about actually who had the sheer willpower to go out and actually deliberately try and put solutions and actually go about and do stuff. And that's why it's because most of this stuff isn't magical, isn't particularly difficult. It's really just simple stuff. And it's just about putting it in place. And it's really, really, really simple stuff.
Some of those, the things you're speaking about, and it comes down to the simplicities of effective communication. It's setting up one-on-ones. It's doing the practical things that great leaders should do.
Yeah, I mean, let me give you one example, right, of one of the things that I've come across recently that I absolutely love. So this is a bit of research that came out recently, having a look at CEOs speaking to boards, and has now been replicated in how any leader can speak with their teams, and it helps information flow. So the original bit of research had a look at how CEOs can build confidence and can evoke confidence in boards. And what it did was it had a look at how CEOs speak to boards. And it found that CEOs who say to boards, "This is the way the world is," actually generate less confidence in boards than CEOs who turn around and go, "Well, actually, you know what? We're probably only about 70-80% sure that this is going to work. And, it may work, it may not. We're only about 78-80% sure it'll work. And there's probably a chance it may fail. And if it fails, this is why. And these are the contingencies that we're going to put in place." And what they discovered is that CEOs who actually don't speak in absolutes and admit that there are doubts, so they're certain about, they're clear about the uncertainty. So they're clear about the uncertainty. And are honest about the uncertainty, and are clear about what that uncertainty is, and then say how they're going to manage it, actually evoke more confidence. And boards are more confident in those CEOs. And so this research pointed out that there's a difference between clarity and certainty. And right, which is quite apparent when you think about it, is that we tend to mix the two up, right? We tend to think that certainty and clarity are different. Are the same thing, but actually they're quite different things. So then some further research came along and found out that leaders who do this with their teams actually build more confidence in those teams as well, right? So any leader can do this with their teams, and it actually builds information flow that those teams then tend to be more honest and more open with their bosses. So if you as a leader with your team, rather than saying to your team, "This is the way the world is," if you start saying with your team, "Hey, listen, right, I think, look, there's a 70% chance of this, there's an 80% chance of this, but you know what? I'm 70% sure that, but there's a 20% chance that, and the reason why there's a 20% chance is this, and I think, we could, in order to mitigate the 20% chance of this is what we need to do." Your team will start replicating that.
Yeah.
And that's really good, because it enables you to see where the risk is, right? So rather than your team saying, "Yes, boss, I'm absolutely sure of this," your team will start saying to you, "Well, I'm 80% sure of that." Rather than saying, "Yes, boss, definitely will I get it done," your team will start saying, "There's an 80% chance that." So you will have a greater line of sight of where the risk is.
Yeah.
It really as a strategy, it really start paying dividend, and you get greater line of sight where the risk is. You get greater information flow. So it's a wonderful, really, really simple technique And it actually, in terms of just increasing information flow, but it really seems to pay a dividends, right? But it isn't rocket science.
But it
just
also
seems to
speaks
work.
to that performative element, when you're actually just telling people and giving them clarity on what it is you're wanting to share instead of the performance. It kind of changes
It's
how
honest.
information delivers. Yeah.
Well, it's actually honest, rather than so the performance. So the pretend bit would be if you're going, I'm absolutely sure that, right? That would we often believe, or we often think, right, that as bosses, as leaders, we have to pretend to be, or we have to act as if we're 100% sure of everything, right? We're super confident on everything, right? When actually we're not always, are we? We're a bit tentative. We think,
Absolutely.
probably, right?
If you could give the listeners something to take away from why they should just head on out and get this book, The Power Trap, and what do you want people to take away from this conversation, and why they should go and check it out?
Power is a really, really tricky thing to hold, right? The power that comes with your job, with being a leader, is a really tricky thing to hold. I think leadership is becoming harder and harder to do, right? And I think the context that you're being put in by organizations is increasingly unhelpful. You're being put under more and more pressure to deliver, and you're being asked to perform more and more, and it's actually becoming harder and harder to do that job. What the book tries to give you and show you is how to do that. And actually, it's a big how-to. The book tries to give you a whole bunch of techniques for actually how to navigate some of those traps that lay ahead of you. Because in that, what looks like the opportunity of leadership, and it is an opportunity, right? There's a whole bunch of traps that lie await for you. Most leaders don't fail, right? Most leaders don't explode in a ball of flames. What happens to most leaders is that they become average. That's what happens to most leaders, right? We make small mistakes. We die the death of 1,000 cuts. That's what happens to most leaders, and we become average, because that's what average is, right? And I think it's actually happening to more and more of us, right? I think fewer and fewer of us really stand out. And that's because leadership's becoming harder, and it's actually hurting more and more of us, right?
Yeah.
And actually the risks of leadership are becoming harder. And what the book tries to do is it tries to show you how to avoid that, right? It tries to show you how to avoid those risks and how to avoid, I think, some of the dangers of a leadership.
Yeah.
And it's a big how to. And I do think the solutions are actually pretty simple. It's just a matter of how do you implement them. And it tries to show you how to do that.
Fantastic.
And it just makes great reading. I think it's a great present for your kids, for your grandparents, for your next door neighbors. I think your pets as well.
It's a good time to go and spend some money on a Christmas gift.
It is. It's Christmas, for New Year's presents. I think every member of the household should probably have one. Yeah.
Psychologist and author of The Power Trap, How Leadership Changes People. Guys, go and check it out. We will have all the description links in the description box below. It's nickkinley.com, and there's the Amazon. You can check the book out on Amazon. And if you want to get in touch with Nick as well, we'll have his LinkedIn description so you can just find out more and touch base. Nick, thank you for the time. Thank you for the conversation.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
And yeah, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Cheers for now.